Yeah, I don't know what lines were down. If you all prefer to have the open, you're welcome to. All right, good afternoon, welcome back. Let's get started for today. I think we're a smaller group today in part because of all the snow and fun going on outside. So we're mid-April, definitely continuing to have some interesting weather. So thank you all for making it here today. If you're not here, then you're probably watching the recording. So thank you for taking the time to check out today's theory and discussion. So what I want to do is have you all start out by either writing or typing. You'll turn this in at the end of class as your attendance for today. And I'd just like to do a check-in regarding the annotated bibliography assignment. This assignment, again, is due by this Sunday. So this is a really good time to start to plan out and search for articles if you haven't already done so. So what I'd like you to do is to think about at this stage which theory you've selected for your annotated bibliography, or if you haven't chosen a theory yet, what are some of the theories that you've started deciding between or you're interested in exploring for this assignment? For instance, the theories we've talked about so far could include symbolic interaction theory, uncertainty reduction theory, social exchange theory, social penetration theory, as we'll be talking about for today, social information processing theory, and as we'll talk about on Friday, agenda setting theory. So those could be among the ones that you're interested in. If you do want to jump ahead and use a theory that we haven't talked about yet in class, if you strongly feel that way, you can do so. But once you kind of know which theory you're using or which theories you're thinking about, have you started looking into articles? And if you have, what has stood out to you or emerged so far? And if you have any questions for me at this stage, I'd love to help you out. I've talked to a couple folks in office hours about it who have shown some articles and asked if they're on a good track. You're welcome to do that either through email or office hours regarding how you feel about the annotated bibliography or sources that you've put together. Remember that the sources don't need to connect to each other as much as they need to connect to the theory. So if you're looking at social exchange theory, you could have 3 very different articles that each talk about social exchange theory in very different ways. And that would be completely fine for this assignment. So I'll give you a little bit of time to work on this.
You want us to turn this in?
Yeah, I'll ask you to hang on to that and then turn that in at the end of class. Yes.
Can we do our annotated bibliography on the same concept that we're doing for our presentation?
Sure.
Have we gotten our assignments for the presentation yet?
Yes, those were submitted through a Canvas announcement just a bit ago, and I'll be reviewing them in just a second.
The next one is social.
So CIAL.
Yes, okay.
So again, I'll ask you to hang on to these for a moment, and we'll talk a little bit about these annotated bibliographies. Does anybody have any questions that they want to share with the class about this assignment at this stage? Anything that's jumped out to you as a roadblock or issue you're running into? Yeah.
I guess, do you care like the date range of when the article was like published?
No. So if it's an older article or newer one, that's fine. One thing you could do though is just to note if it's an older article, like in your own analysis, parts of it that might be outdated or feel like they've changed. Like if they're using social information processing and they're talking about like an era before the internet, we might talk about how the theory has kind of emerged or been used differently. Yeah.
You can cite it in any style you want.
Yeah. Yes, MLA, APA, or Chicago. So
Just be consistent throughout your annotation.
yes, yes. URL is not a style, right? So while you might include the URL depending on the source style that you use, you would need to include the article, date, and other information too. Again, I recommend looking back to that example that I have on Canvas that's doing it in APA so you have a sense of what to expect. Again, I'll look over drafts or outlines. Let me know as soon as possible if you need an extension and know you have stuff coming up this week that'll affect your ability to complete it. Otherwise, the late policy is -10% or -5% for each day late. So an 85 becomes an 80 and so forth. If you realize you have questions about this assignment or anything else at this stage later, feel free to let me know and I'm happy to answer that for you. As a quick recap, we talked about social penetration theory last class. We also talked about the expectations for the presentation, and I'll share the presentation schedule along with the rubric on Canvas in just a second. But we explored social penetration theory. This is the onion Shrek theory about how we have different layers of self-disclosure. So we also talked about how this theory goes over 4 different stages. So the blank stage is defined by complete openness in relationships. Which of those 4 stages would it?
The stage is not the layers.
So, right, the stages. We talked about the layers like peripheral, central. There's also stages such as the orientation stage. Yeah, stable. Yeah, so stable, right? So in addition to the layers of the onion, right, it's the idea that we move between stages in a relationship. Think about the onion as your own parts of yourself that you choose to share or disclose. And you can think about the stages, it's more about how you and that other person have developed over the course of your relationship. So the stable stage is totally open, totally comfortable with one another. Again, this is a useful theory in looking at our interpersonal relationships with each other and how we choose to share and disclose information. For today, we'll be exploring social information processing theory, which I'll abbreviate as SIP. So SIP is interpersonal, but it's starting to shift gears and focus a little bit more on the relationship between communication and technology, right? So communication is still interpersonal if it's between 2 people and it's using mediated communication to do so, right? So for instance, a Zoom call with somebody or a phone call is interpersonal because it is between 2 people, but it's using different forms of media to engage with each other. So we'll talk a little bit about that and also applying SIP to a lot of examples of mediated communication. This is obviously a theory that has been super relevant within the context of COVID-19. So the presentation schedule I posted to Canvas earlier using the forms that you all filled out. I did my best to honor your preferences about dates and any conflicts that you might have had. There are a couple dates in the class because we have fewer class meetings than people where we have multiple people who will be sharing. So we'll just kind of go through and have both people share their presentations, and then we'll move on from there. So just to be clear, you would be still sharing an individual presentation. You're not working with the other person, but each person could offer their own perspective on how that theory matters. So you would be graded separately. If you cover similar material to the other person, that doesn't impact your grade or anything like that, just that you have multiple perspectives on these theories. So these will start on the 18th with Riley on spiral of silence, Presley on uses of gratification, Angela on face negotiation, Jane on communication privacy management, JP and Isaac on groupthink, Kendra on organizational culture, Gavin on rhetoric, Daniel on dramatism, Logan narrative paradigm, Kate and Kenna on media ecology, Haley on communication accommodation, Jessica on relational dialectics, Kiana on cultivation, James on cultural studies, Gabe on music group, and Maddie on feminist standpoint. So if you are noticing any sort of issue with the presentation, like you can't make your date, send me an email and I'll be able to revise the presentation schedule. So just make sure to double check your schedule and make sure that you're available on that day and for that theory. On that day, I'll just set aside some time at the beginning of class for you to share, and we'll work from there. So that's the schedule, and that's the stuff that corresponds to those theories. What I want to do next is show you the rubrics so you know how I'll be grading this and what you can expect from the overall breakdown on this assignment. So if you go up here on the top, there is the class presentation that's also listed under assignments. But you can click on this right here to submit your presentation outline. So as a reminder, I'm asking you to turn in an outline for this presentation that's 1 to 2 pages in length, at least 24 hours before your presentation. So before 1 p.m. On either the Sunday, Tuesday, or Thursday before you present it. That just goes over the main things that you'll be covering in the presentation. Again, I highly encourage that you print out or have your outline available on your device. That way you can refer to it as you're working, and it just gives you something to draw from as you're working on the presentation. So the rubric is divided into 3 parts for a total of 100 points. 100 points, which is 10% of your grade overall. The first part is the outline, right? So the outline is 40 points. It's a good chunk of your grade. An excellent outline is turned in at least a day in advance. It's 1 to 2 pages. It includes complete sentences, and it closely matches the things that you're covering in your presentation. So it doesn't need to be a word for word of what's in the outline to your presentation, but it should track pretty closely with what you're sharing. A good outline might have some errors, like a lack of complete sentences, or maybe not fully aligning with the presentation. If that outline is turned in late, might have some major errors. It might not reach a full page, and you'd receive a 0 here if there was no outline turned in. As far as content goes, I highly recommend that you do a practice or 2, and I'm not grading on your formal public speaking ability, but I do ask that you come in prepared, having thought about this presentation and practice with yourself or with somebody like a roommate, friend, or family member. The presentation should be 4 to 6 minutes long. I'll give you time signals to let you know how you're working through it. And I'm asking you to engage with that theory and show your understanding of it, right? So if you're in that time range and able to provide content that really shows us this theory in action, you're in good shape. If you're a little bit too short or too long, then you're in that kind of good range. If you're way too long or way too short, or your presentation really has nothing to do with the theory, then the content score would be a lot lower. And then the last thing that I'm looking at and assessing is sort of your engagement, right? Because I'm asking you to answer the question, why does this theory matter to our lives? If you're using interesting personal examples, or using media, or supporting evidence or content, right? Again, there's a lot of flexibility on how you choose to answer that question or present, through the use of slides. Could include video clips. You could use sort of, something that's creative even like the use poetry, dance, or something similar, it's up to you, right? I'm not asking, of course, everybody to do something like that if you're not comfortable, but find a way to make this interesting and engaging. The big thing that I'm looking for here is just that you're not giving a summary of the theory or explaining the theory to us, right? Because we'll be doing that right after your presentation. But again, to help us understand why we should care about this theory. So if you find that there's an interesting way that you can prove that or show that, like the use of an example that shows the theory in action in the world, like a current event, that could be one way to explore that. So that is the rubric. Those are the things that I'm looking for and how I'll be grading this overall assignment. I'll look over outlines or even a practice presentation if you'd like to present in my office or something similar ahead of time, and I'll let you know how I feel about things going forward. So any questions here on the rubric, on anything about the presentation at this point? Again, please double check your presentation date. If something comes up, for example, an emergency, or you're under quarantine or something similar, and you're not able to attend for your presentation date, that's okay. We would give you a rescheduled time to present the theory that you were originally assigned. But otherwise, if it's unexcused, then the presentation would not be able to be made up in class. So just make sure that you are available and ready for that day. All right. So let's go ahead and dive into SIP. Social information processing theory is an interesting one. And again, it's one of those theories that you might find yourself largely agreeing with or pushing back with or finding yourself somewhere in between. But the idea here is that the way that we use online and mediated communication to manage ourselves and who we are offers some really unique opportunities that we oftentimes are very successful and satisfied with how we create an online identity or persona, right, that we offer through our online communication. One really good example of this is the sort of life sim computer game Second Life. Dr. Anderson, who's a professor in our communication studies program, actually has a class in which students participate in Second Life. So if you find this interesting and the use of sort of virtual mediated communication to convey identity and create culture online is interesting to you, I highly recommend taking her course. So this theory, again, takes a socio-psychological, interpersonal, and positivistic empirical approach, again, dealing with the idea that interpersonal communication is not just face-to-face, but that it happens online. It can happen through the use of online characters or avatars and use of media, right? The purpose of a game like Second Life is that you create your own character or avatar, and you find yourself like talking, spending time, going to parties, going to houses, like doing sort of social activities, but using the online virtual avatar to do so. If you've played games like MMO style games, World of Warcraft, there are similar examples of SIP in action, right? Creating those virtual avatars to use online settings to communicate. That's one example, but another way we can think about SIP is about how you present yourself as a person in online settings. For instance, when you post to social media, including Instagram, do you use filters or alterations that make your physical appearance look different? Also, what information do you choose to share online? For instance, the sort of first question might be, what forms of social media, if any, do you use? There's been a lot of demographic changes surrounding how social media has been used. For instance, fewer and fewer people use Facebook. More and more people are using TikTok, right? And so those kinds of changes, how we use social media, if at all, are one big factor, but also what content we choose to include. For instance, what is public versus what is only with friends or connections versus what is private, or even content that we choose to share with friends or network, but restrict from specific people. Are examples of this theory in practice. So this theory comes from Joseph Walker, who is a communications scholar and professor at UC Santa Barbara, where I'm sure it's much warmer than this right now. And Dr. Walker basically developed this theory well before we saw this proliferation of social media and online communication that we see now. So we had, communication through basic computer technology, but we didn't necessarily see the use of online and mediated communication to the extent that we see now. But that still laid the groundwork for this theory, and I think in many ways is even more relevant than it used to be in explaining our behavior online. Again, there's a lot of examples of popular online games and social opportunities. For instance, if you ever played the game Club Penguin, which got shut down a couple of years ago, it's an example of a game where you had this like penguin character and you did silly things like snowball fights or parties online. I was a really big fan as a kid of the game Neopets, where you created a little virtual pet online and played games with that pet, right? There's a lot of examples of how we use these online settings to create characters that we use to message and communicate with one another. So one of the core assumptions here about SIP is this idea that computer-mediated communication brings us some unique opportunities to connect with and to relate to other people. For instance, oftentimes, a lot of our discussions surrounding COVID-19 has been, hey, we've been stuck online, we've been stuck in Zoom meetings, those are exhausting, it felt fun, we miss face-to-face interactions. A lot of people have expressed that frustration. Some people have said, hey, we now know that some content can be done remotely and that we don't have to have face-to-face meetings anymore, and I've appreciated that shift to online settings. So a lot of discussion has been about the limits and opportunities of online mediated ways to communicate. Us acknowledging that when we're talking to a little rectangle, that can be less connected or less meaningful, and that's been a cause of concern. We also know that because using outlets like Zoom in a two-dimensional space where you're trying to make sense of nonverbal communication like facial expressions actually contributes to our brains working in overdrive, especially if we have a lot of boxes open and a lot of people in a Zoom message, and we're trying to pick up on the communication from everybody in that meeting. It actually means that we experience fatigue and exhaustion at a much greater level than we do face-to-face, right? So while that's one concern, SIP takes a very different approach and says, actually, the use of computer-mediated communication offers unique and specific ways that we connect and relate to each other that we don't get face-to-face, right? We don't get to be a little penguin or, be a wizard in an MMO or take on the type of role online that we do face-to-face. Another sort of core idea here in this theory is this idea of impression management. That oftentimes when we communicate online, we are specifically motivated to create favorable impressions of ourselves and who we are. So think about it this way. If you meet somebody face-to-face, there are a lot of things that they can immediately pick up on from you in a conversation. For instance, things related to your physical appearance, your speaking style, your mannerisms, and so on. There's not a lot that's up to the imagination, at least on a basic, superficial, and physical level about who you are. Compare that to creating an online profile, like on an online dating website, right? A lot of online dating sites and apps actually include, the majority of people who use them actually include some degree of false or incorrect information. Oftentimes, this is like a white lie, such as disclosing a weight as slightly lower than what your actual weight might be. Sometimes it's using older or outdated photos, but when you have the ability to introduce yourself online, such as through messaging somebody, then you're able to sort of censor or change some of the things that you share, right? How would somebody know those differences if they hadn't met you face-to-face and they were just going off of an online profile, right? Similarly, through the use of apps like TikTok, right? When people upload and share videos with each other, They are curating those in terms of what somebody's physical appearance looks like, whether or not they're using filters, what physical location that they're using for that, and so on, which might be different than what it looks like to actually meet them. And this idea here too is that online interpersonal relationships require extended time and accumulated messages to develop equivalent levels of intimacy that we see compared to face-to-face relationships. So in other words, right, again, going back to the idea that so much of our interpersonal communication is nonverbal face-to-face settings, that basically we have to make up for a lot more through more correspondence online, right? For instance, think about if you're messaging somebody and you want to tell a joke or be sarcastic. One way that you might do that is to develop context cues in the message. For instance, using the slash followed by S to indicate sarcasm, or just making it really clear that a message is not intended to be taken seriously, right? We oftentimes use a lot more signals and cues that are much faster and easier to convey face-to-face. We might also use a lot of communication to indicate comfort between one another, right? So oftentimes, over time, we have to develop more trust with that person compared to actually meeting them face-to-face. In fact, in a lot of cases of catfishing or of scams, it has taken months for the scammer to communicate and build trust with the person, such as when they say, oh, I was trying to visit you, but I can't afford my flight. You're going to have to wire me $1,000. Somebody actually feels in that context like they're telling the truth, right? Scams develop because there's this very extensive process of trust through extended communication. Again, if you haven't seen it, the Netflix documentary, Bad Vegan, that's a case of a very well-off restaurant owner who ends up wiring like over $20 million to a scammer, or is an example of how online and mediated communication can build levels of trust in a negative way. Some of the key concepts of this include strategic disclosure. So I'm going to show a clip. If you've seen the film or heard of the film Her, starring Joaquin Phoenix and Scarlett Johansson, right? This was a film in which the main character starts to form a romantic attachment to an artificial intelligence that can only speak to him through audio. And there's this whole kind of interesting ethical and sort of Black Mirror-esque discussion about the use of technology to relate to and build relationships with others. A core idea here is this idea of strategic disclosure, that we share information to get to know other people better. Thinking back to the idea of social penetration theory, that we are sort of unpeeling the onion and choosing to share more and more personal or intimate relationships, information with each other. Social presence theory is sort of a related theory to this idea. It's the idea that we oftentimes will use media in order to make each other aware of one another. For instance, oftentimes people will use things such as a like or mutual friends in order to form connections. They see that there's a mutual friend and they think, huh, this person's interesting. Maybe I'll message this mutual friend and get to know them. Also, right, there might be a question of, you Google yourself and what shows up. Oftentimes people will, especially if they're preparing for jobs, make sure that they've created something like a LinkedIn or professional profile, or sometimes will even create a professional website, knowing that that will allow them to be the first hit. So social presence theory is how we might use that to communicate. Media richness theory is a theory that argues that our use of media to communicate with one another is on a spectrum. So on the far end of the spectrum, on very thin or not very rich media, we have things like an email. An email is asynchronous. You send an email, you wait a while, you get it back. You are not communicating as directly. You're probably not using video or photos to communicate with one another, right? It's all text and it's asynchronous. On the other extreme, you might have something like a FaceTime or Zoom call, where while it's not the same as face-to-face, it is, using senses, it's using audio, it's using video, it's synchronous and occurring in real time. So our use of media can run a spectrum between totally disconnected through email, maybe a little bit more connected through something like a text where you're exchanging gifts or you're communicating kind of back and forth, to very connected through something like a Zoom call. The hyper-personal perspective is a theory that when we communicate online, sometimes that can be more intimate or closer than a face-to-face relationship, right? And there's a couple reasons that we might attribute to it. One of them being the idea that our online relationships are ones that we can communicate with much more regularly. If you're seeing a friend, right, there are limitations to how often you can actually physically see that person before you and them have to go home or leave campus or something similar. Whereas texting or communicating online can continue for much longer. The other idea here is that when you're engaging, for instance, in virtual reality or a video game or something similar, that you're doing things that connect you to that person that you can't do in real life. That again sort of suggests the hyper-personal. And then lastly, there's this idea of warranting. Warranting, according to SIP, is the idea that we are trying to gather information to ensure that what we see and hear about somebody is true and is legit, right? So for instance, somebody tells us their name and messages us telling us about their job, and then we do a search to try to find their LinkedIn profile so we can see that they actually have the job they say they have listed. So those might be some ways that we incorporate SIP. Another idea here is sort of the idea of self and how we view self, right? So there's somebody that's looking into a mirror, and maybe it's a kid who wants to be a grown-up, who wants to be an adult. If you've seen films like 13 Going on 30, right? Those types of films have characters who oftentimes want to be older than they are and want to grow up quickly. And in that same way, we see who we are, but also take stock of that relative to who we want to be, right? So our actual self refers to who we are as people, ourselves. So it's things that we know about ourselves that are true, right? Maybe we get on the scale or look in the mirror or just know certain things about us that are true. An ideal is the version of ourselves that in the perfect world we would like to be. For instance, maybe there are adjustments or changes that we want for our appearance or our age and so on that would make us more closely look like our ideal self. And then given that, and given sort of the gulf that we might have between who we are and who we want to be, we have an ought self, that is who we think we should be. We recognize we might not be the total ideal, right? There might be limitations there, but we still think that there are things that we can do to adjust or change our approach that could more closely align with our ideal self. So an ought self is more realistically, what could we do or change about ourselves that could get us closer to the ideal, right? And for some people, they might be at that ideal. There's also a lot of value in questioning or sort of exploring why it is that we might hold an ideal self that we do about ourselves. What are the cultural assumptions, stereotypes, pressures that lead us to want to be a certain way? Those are worth considering. But those versions of ourselves, who we want to be versus who we are, might motivate us to change our online behavior, right? If there's an ideal self that's very different from who we are in real life, we might choose to present or share that ideal self in an online setting. This theory, of course, like other theories that we talked about, has some critiques. This is a pretty widely used theory in understanding media and communication. One critique is that because the process of developing relationships and connections online takes a whole lot of time, it's a hard theory to test, right? It basically requires us to do like a longitudinal study to test how a relationship develops online over a period of like 8 or 9 months. And so as a result, it's harder to really confirm the accuracy of that theory, right? Another idea, again, something that I think we've become pretty acutely aware of over the last couple of years, such as using Zoom for a lot of things, has been that there are some parts of relationships that cannot be replicated online. For instance, the use of physical touch, the use of physical proximity to somebody else, the use of some of the non-verbal cues like tone of voice that are harder to translate online. There are connections and social fulfillment that we get face-to-face that we don't get online, that I think somewhat challenges this theory too. And also, there's the idea that we're not just motivated by impression management, right? That managing and presenting the ideal version of ourselves is not always what we intend to do. In fact, in kind of looking at how TikTok has been used in the context of disclosure and discussion of mental health in particular, some people who use TikTok will very explicitly choose to self-disclose and share challenges related to mental health or other issues. Not because it's an ideal self, but because they want to present who they are as a basis of connection and relating to other people, right? So sometimes we're not always motivated to present an ideal self online. Sometimes we even put value in presenting a more honest version of ourselves online too, right? For instance, some beauty companies or companies that produce things such as makeup or lip gloss or things similar specifically say, oh, we haven't photoshopped any of this. We're showing real models and we're going to show, the flaws of the people without any edits and treat that in a positive way too. As mentioned, Second Life is one example of how we use SIP. It's an example of the use of a game or sort of a social opportunity developed in 2013 and gained a pretty impressive following with millions of players and is sort of an example of using online and mediated communication as a way to develop meaningful connections with others. So I just wanted to show a short clip from that to contextualize this. So it's an example, right, of getting to use a lot of, like fun activities. If you're on a roller coaster, you're, spending time in a city together, you're doing activities in this online setting that you didn't necessarily get to do face to face. I'm curious, has anybody played Animal Crossing? Maybe a couple of you. I played it a bunch during COVID, and that was kind of similar, right? It's a video game where you're on an island, you're building a town, you're interacting with other players, including online. And I think especially with COVID and our inability to do a lot of face-to-face connections, we really enjoyed the respite and break that we had in getting to engage in an online community to build social connection with other people. So what I want to do now is take some time to have you all discuss in some small groups a few things. First of all, what might be an example of close interpersonal relationships that develop online and how that might connect to this theory. The question of whether or not online relationships can be deeper than face-to-face relationships, why or why not, and how your group feels about the persuasiveness of SIP as a theory to understand and explain our engagement online. So since we have a smaller set of people today, we have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 12. Let's do 2 groups of 6. So we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You all together, and then we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 you all together. Take some time, have each group share and talk about these questions. Then I'll ask you to share some of your thoughts about this with the group more broadly.
Right.
Let's discuss it right.
You can just discuss, if you have any notes that you want to prepare to share with us, you can develop those.
Who wants to take notes? I can. Beautiful. Something that comes to mind is
I tried to stay off of that.
I guess.
Yeah, dating apps.
A lot of dating apps. So
Oh,
perhaps
FaceTime.
mutual. I did once. And that was for specifically like
There's online
meeting for my family. Was it connections?
But I think that's not actually. And you. Like, I was somewhere. I'm not doing that. He's like,
There's like ethics to one of them.
Yes. And then some honestly, I think they
Oh,
Instagram. Like some people have like their Instagram that they have like their Instagram. So like.
Yeah, you can never
if you're a
reach them again.
teenage teenager, you don't want your parents to see what you're doing, if you're keeping out of the house or whatever. You have a different one that your friends actually.
Oh.
That you're-
No.
I know there's like
You tell
four-
people you're not.
I know there's actually four of them, but
Yeah, depending on.
I would think that would be.
Okay. Can online relationships be?
Can online relationships, can online relationships be people in abusive relationships, why? I'm mixed. Yeah. Yeah, and how do you judge that, right? You can't see their body language and when it is missing like 60 years.
All you have to do is shut up. And you don't want to talk to them.
Usually the source.
Right, like they fall in love with like their version.
Their idea.
And they're not just like communication. There's always.
Well,
something
because you
that
can't
can
see
get
them, you can't tell if you hurt them or not, you can really just say whatever.
Yeah, I didn't make it.
Or.
And I think that it also kind of depends on the person, because some people are really willing to share whatever they're feeling online.
Yeah.
And they won't do that in person, like good, bad, anything. And so then you can't really form a relationship with people if you're only, you're not willing to talk to them. But if you are online, you're not going to have some relationships.
Well, and I think, between like extroversion and introversion, so like whether you prefer in that sense, I really believe I'm an extrovert because I love people, I love being social, love being out there. But like being home stuck behind a computer, like would drive me nuts. But for some people, that's home is their comfortable space, that's their safe space, and so when they're comfortable, they're willing to share whatever they need.
Like, I get that people will do stuff like that. And they try to make it individual. But like, the more to be on the internet is this.
Yeah, so like this is kind of like basic interpretation.
I think it also depends on the situation, and yes, it can. I think it really just
It
depends
also
on the
depends on
person.
the society.
I wrote situational.
It is very situational. I think a lot of it is very situational.
Taking a couple more minutes to discuss.
Do we think it's pervasive enough?
Yeah,
I've seen the Office.
a little bit. Is that there a reference or something in there that?
I was going to use Dwight, Richard Blake, Shane Dwight.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know for sure.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of shows where they'll like have an episode where people are playing a game like that. Or, yeah.
For this theory, I feel like it'll be always developing because online and like
Right,
social
it takes
media
time.
and apps and constantly developing things and now.
It takes a lot of things to do. Because we check
I've never been into watching TV. My dad took me there and I was because he wanted us to be outside where schools on the and so I've never watched TV since I've been here until like 3 weeks ago when the term started. And I've never gotten so behind
So what you see
in
is
schoolwork because all I want to do is watch it.
unless you're like, all right, we have some common interest, okay, we'll see how it goes.
I didn't watch so.
All right, so I've heard a few interesting things from each of the groups here regarding what you all thought about this theory and some examples. So let's start here on this side. What were some things that you all talked about regarding this theory?
Yes, we said that this theory doesn't take into account that a lot of mediums that you can get online are also somebody.
Yeah, that's an important example. What was something that you all looked at as like an instance of using interpersonal communication online?
People post themselves on social media and all the way they work. Or they'll have pick areas that make the features pop up. Like
Yeah.
you want to choose a specific lighting that makes it look less flushed out. I agree.
Sure.
How they look.
Sure. Yeah, so I think one really good point you all raised, right, as Daniel brought up, is this idea that that ultimately a lot of these apps and social media sites are products. They're trying to get us to use them. Oftentimes they're trying to get us to use like a paid or premium account. They have a lot of advertisements, sponsored content, right? They have an incentive for us to use the online communication that could impact our decisions. For instance, there's been a lot of discussion about how algorithms are used to like issue bans or to regulate behavior that's done online in compliance with like terms of service or guidelines. Marshall McLuhan, an old theorist about communication, used to say the medium is the message, right? The idea that the way in which a message is delivered, like an app that's used, significantly impacts or constrains the message. What somebody shares on Facebook versus what somebody shares on TikTok or Instagram might look really different in terms of its content, right? So the fact that there's an incentive to draw us in using online communication, maybe even over face-to-face, is an important consideration, that it's not just about impression management, but that it's about sort of drawing us in to use technology based on advertising. How about on this side? What were some things that you all discussed?
We talked about like dating apps and social media and stuff, how you can create multiple accounts with different versions
Yeah,
of yourself, and it's like the other group was saying, how it's really filtered and cater to what you want to show. And then for the second question, we said that online relationships being deeper than face-to-face is very situational, depending on the medium that you're using and the people involved. And we thought that even though the theory and the internet are always changing, it's a persuasive thought.
yeah. I like this idea of people using alternative accounts, right? Because sometimes you might use them as like a lurker or like account that just lets you avoid knowing that you've been seen. Sometimes we present a really different version of ourselves or pretend we're somebody entirely different. Or sometimes I've seen people who will post like an account that's like a parent-friendly version and then an account that's more of a social version of their friends too, which sort of complicates this matter as well. So some really good observations here on SIP and some of the ways that it's changed. Just as a reminder, that presentation schedule is up, and please use that to lock in your gate and just make sure you know what you need to do. SIP, as we've talked about, helps us to understand the relationships we create and how we can form meaningful relationships online. On Friday, we'll be talking about agenda setting theory, moving on to discussing media's role in communication. We'll get to talk about Balloon Boy, which is always fun. So interesting theory coming up for Friday. go ahead and pass forward that individual activity I asked you to work on from the beginning of class. Make sure your name's on it. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and I'll see you again for Friday.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks, too.
Thank you.